A good picture is one that is surprising. Nothing has not been photographed. So it's a picture of something that may be familiar to me, but it's described in a way I've never seen before. So there's something utterly surprising about it, and it's making me understand the moment, the situation in a new way. Well, how did growing up in Vietnam inform my life here as a Vietnamese American, as an artist, as a parent, as a teacher? Well, it's growing pains. It's something that is an ongoing process and an ongoing experience that I've had to sort of parse out and try to understand. And I think that being an artist has really helped me make my way through. I think that we felt very grateful being able to escape Vietnam at the end of the war and being evacuated and brought to the United States. Things were not easy. My parents found a job very quickly or invented a job for themselves, helping other refugees adapt to the American education system. And we finished high school, we were able to go to college. My brothers and I were the first generation of Vietnamese refugees to apply to college, so I think our story was very interesting. We were good students, so we were able to go to really good schools. I think as we continued, we started feeling these very antagonistic and paradoxical feelings of being grateful, but then also feeling that we didn't really belong here, that we were a burden on this society and this country. And I think it's something that I've always dealt with throughout my entire career as an artist, to try to parse out that sense of being grateful, but also being a reminder of this terrible war that devastated not only Vietnam, but also the United States. My life story, my origin story, really shaped the way what kind of photographer I became. I think as an outsider, as someone who feels very not antagonistic, but contradictory feelings about, being grateful, but then also feeling that you don't really belong here, I think forced you to kind of observe, because you're an outsider, because you don't belong. So, I've spent a lot of my time in high school, college, looking at things and studying manners, and I think it's a kind of humbling experience to feel that you don't belong, but that perhaps there are other things you can do besides being the wallflower. You can actually, and I think that's why photography was so great, because when I discovered the camera, you could actually do something, right? Instead of just standing there and observing, you can actually make pictures. I think if I loved writing, I would have become a writer, and I think that's part of the idea of being on the sideline and observing and taking notes. And so I think photography sort of gave me the license to continue observing and asking questions and being quiet on the side. it's serendipitous how I discovered photography. You know, like children, like many children of immigrants, refugees, having seen, you know, having experienced what your parents went through and what you lived through. I think on your mind is always the notion of what am I going to do to survive, to help the family, to help myself, and certainly one looks at jobs and futures that are more connected to the science, you know, also because English was not our first language. So I had no particular facilities. I mean, I was good in the sciences, but I was not as good as my brothers who became engineers, so I decided that biology could be a good field for me, and probably medicine. So I did apply to medical schools. My grades were not so good. You know, the difference in American high schools and American colleges is quite drastic. And so as much as high school was easy, college at Stanford was very difficult. So my grades were not so good. So I was not accepted to medical school. And someone suggested that I go back to school, get a master's degree in biology, and apply again, and also do research in science. So I did all of that. And as I was finishing my master's degree in biology, I saw that I could take a non-science course. And I wanted to take drawing because I thought that that would be something that didn't require materials. I could travel with a pad and a pencil. The class was filled up. So I saw that photography was open, so I took photography and completely fell in love. Yeah, I didn't even own a camera at the point, so I had to borrow a camera. And I think that it was the answer to a kind of curiosity I had that we spoke about earlier, you know, this idea of having a question, being curious about something, and actually using the camera as a license to go to those places, to be able to enter a group and understand or see something about them. And that was just, it sort of changed my life. And I think I knew that I was visual when I started photography. I didn't know how good I was, but maybe it was reckless, but I felt that I needed to find out whether this could turn into something substantial. So I did that for a year. And then at the end of the year, this one photography professor that I became very friendly with sort of suggested that I should consider becoming a photographer. I think when I started out, I was absolutely enthralled with Cartier-Bresson's work and, you know, the more decisive moment and pictures where everything just fit in and, you know, there was some kind of spontaneous description of something that matched something else, and it seemed that everything just resonated in this one particular moment. And then I realized that those pictures perhaps were not as complex as you know, a great short story, perhaps, that could tackle conflict or antagonistic feelings and complex feelings, paradoxical feelings. So then I think I moved away from those photographers, started looking at landscape photography, and then I started working with a large format camera. And that's when I started studying the 19th century photographers. And I moved to a large format camera because I just loved the way the world is described, not just because of the sharpness of things, especially back then, so this is like in the 90s, but the way the large format negatives described the air and the space between things, and there was something so physical about the quality of the prints that one would get. But studying the 19th century photographers, I was attracted to them because of the way they describe scale, the way they use scales. You know, they always photograph something that is monumental or sublime, and the description was always very interesting. But beyond that, I was also interested in what the view camera can't do. You know, it just became fascinating to me when I looked at the way wars were photographed, right? You can't be spontaneous. During the Civil War, Timothy O'Sullivan, you look at Roger Fenton's work. And so what did they do? So they photographed before, they photographed afterwards, they moved things around, and that was fascinating to me. So that idea of looking for not just what was in front of you and what you should be photographing, but something that is secondary to the main event. And that was really fascinating to me. So I think it's how you approach the world. And you don't necessarily have to approach it by describing the most important event that is unfolding. It's not facts that are important to me. I think that what photography does really well is to describe things. You know, there's an evidentiary quality to photography. And so, you know, it's about describing something in a way that hasn't been seen before. And it has to do with pure description, attention to details. You know, just a slight turn of a body suggests a different psychology to a person. You know, someone who, you know, I photographed a lot of workers, and there's something about the choreography, the way that, because they've done that, you know, like cutting asparagus or picking something, and they've done it so much that the gesture feels so masterful that you need to describe that really well. And it has gravitas, right? So it's about describing describing details, describing the way a shirt is kind of bent up, someone's, you know, the lines under someone's face, but in a way that's surprising, that suggests something about their psychology, their origin story. For me, it's a very analytical and intellectual engagement. So, you know, you see a moment and you have to decide it's about solving the problem of how to make that picture, how to make things fit, what to include, what to exclude. You move slightly this way and things don't line up, or they line up. You go up or low, and the horizon line changes. You know, so many decisions to make. And I think once you make that decision, then it becomes kind of an intellectual engagement in terms of your ideas. And some of it happens on the spot, some of it happens later when you look through your contact sheet and decide what you want to print. So I think it requires it's a kind of multitasking too, you know, and you have to engage with the world. I think that it requires one to be, you know, courageous, because sometimes you need to go to places that you don't normally go to, or make decisions to go to, make a decision to do something that you may fail, or you don't know how it's going to work out, having to ask permission. I think even people who work in the studio, you know, it's about realizing something that you don't know. So dealing with the unknown is something that is a big part of being a photographer, I think. I mean, I think that we all ask ourselves, you know, like, who am I at some point in our life? And I certainly thought, you know, I was comfortable here in the United States. I've lived in France and can speak French, and I feel comfortable there. But who am I really? And I thought that perhaps the missing part was not being able to go back to Vietnam. And so when, in the mid-1990s, when I was able to go back safely, I thought that I would find the answer there. And I think as soon as I got there, I realized that that was not true, and that actually, I think being an artist was the no place, the kind of in-between, that I was okay being in this no place zone because I was an artist, and that it was perfectly fine, you know, and we're all sort of in this no zone, no place. Well, there's this one photograph I made early on in Vietnam that was very significant for me. I was in the delta of the Mekong, and growing up, it was very dangerous to go to the delta. And so here I was actually able to drive around and explore, and I always felt it was emotional. And I think that I was traveling on a motorbike with someone else, and saw this arbor of trees and bamboo trees and ducks running around, and a beautiful little rivulet. And so I told my driver to stop, and these people came out, and there was a couple here, and there were children somewhere else. And I sort of instinctively placed them together under this arbor of trees and made the photograph. And somehow it kind of represented this sort of stable, safe family unit that would probably have existed in spite of the war or something like that. And so that picture was kind of meaningful to me. Well, one thing that I've realized once I started working and exploring the notion of first the war in Vietnam and eventually other wars, other conflicts, was that I was not interested in photographing war. I was more interested in photographing people's ideas of war. I was interested in photographing the notion of war in history. I was interested in conflicts. And this is all because of my complex feelings about the war in Vietnam. So feeling at the same time and the devastation and reeling over the devastation during the war, what happened to our country, the number of dead civilians and North and South Vietnamese soldiers, but also American soldiers and student protesters during the Vietnam War. But at the same time, having positive feelings because of the way the war has changed my life and giving me new opportunities and a much more interesting life than if I'd stayed in Vietnam. And so I think dealing with these complex feelings sort of guided me through my explorations, and I can approach a moment when I'm working with the military and being completely fascinated by the gear, overwhelmed by this might, but also feeling incredibly saddened by the future of these young American men who were being sent off to war. So it was, and I think that I was not, I was determined to continue exploring the topics with these paradoxical feelings about it. And probably because combat photography and war pictures are just so confrontational, right? They're so in your face. I was always looking for something that was a little bit more subtle. And sometimes people miss things, So looking for more subtleties and looking, not necessarily making pictures that don't take a standpoint or that are kind of waffling, but taking pictures that don't necessarily tell people how to think. It's about allowing people to discover the events, the facts that are in the pictures, and then allowing them the space to think for themselves. So more bringing attention to the subject rather than telling people how to feel. Because I think that's something that I also resented during the Vietnam War. It's so easy to see pictures, and I think it was necessary, definitely, to bring attention to this war that was unjustified and that was devastating. But the pictures that made it so clear the Vietnamese are the victims, and it's awful, and look at this, and I think I felt so manipulated often, and I sort of resented that sort of description of Vietnam and the war, which is, you know, I'm not saying it's not devastating and not horrible, but I think there were other things that were just as interesting. It was not the photographing soldiers training at war or photographing the American military was not necessarily my first priority. You know, I spent a lot of time in Vietnam when the United States renewed relations with Vietnam in the mid-1990s. I spent a lot of time photographing there. But I think after a few years, I realized that the big elephant in the room was the war, and I needed to engage with that. So this was 1999, and I think the only solution that I found was to photograph these young American men who were reenacting the Vietnam War. So through a friend, I heard about them. I heard there were groups of young American men reenacting the Vietnam War, and I contacted one of those groups. I made a number of pictures of me playing the sniper girl from Full Metal Jacket when I worked with the reenactors. And it was a bit of a learning experience because I think that I came to realize that it was very important to choose the location and that the landscape needed to be interesting enough before I asked the reenactors to kind of place themselves and then for myself to place and to place myself in the picture. So I did a number of them to test out different landscapes, and certainly the reenactors didn't like being shot at, but they obliged. But I love these pictures because I think that it kind of gave me agency, and I felt like I was directing my own little film, which I think I was. And so from there, I just went on to photographing real soldiers training for war when we invaded Iraq. And this led to another exploration of the American military-industrial complex. The video is a 35 millimeter film in black and white. Actually, maybe it was shot in color and we changed it to black and white. And I wanted to photograph this exercise that trained the Marines on how to deal with an ambush. So this was in 2004, perhaps, 2005. We had invaded Iraq 2 years previously. So you have a long shot of the training, which is more about the landscape, and this kind of bird's eye view, which is more strategies and decisions. And then you have a really tight close-up of the Marines after the training, and they're getting critical feedback from their trainer about their performances. And I was so moved when I saw the raw footage of these close-ups because a lot of these young Marines, and it includes women as well. This was before women were accepted in combat. The women were drivers or cooks or in intelligence, but they were also trained for these instances. But I was so moved because they were just young men and women the age of my students or my friends or my neighbors' children, so full of life, so full of idealism, and they were being shipped off to war. And it was also their first time going to Iraq. So I think it was very, very painful it was heartbreaking to see how vulnerable they were. When I started this new project, Silent General, which kind of opened the subject matter to just about anything, and it gave me a lot of freedom, but it was also a little terrifying, thinking about where I would go next and what I would photograph. I I would come home. I think we moved to a neighborhood in Brooklyn, and one day on 9/11, I can't remember what year exactly, I saw my neighbor from across the street coming out of his house, dressed formally dressed as a fireman. He had been retired, but he was going to the 9/11 ceremony, and it was just it. It brought me back to that moment in time, and how devastating that event was for New York, for the United States. And he kind of embodied, the courage and I think the work, the commitment that the firemen did that day. And so I was so impressed. Immediately I thought of the kind of picture I could make, and I don't think I was able to find the answer that day, so I sort of let it go. The following year, I saw him, and then I finally reacted, and I said, Jimmy, when you come back, I'm going to be here. I'm going to go get my camera, and I will be back and photograph you. And so, in that afternoon, I set the picture up and made a portrait of him. Yeah, I think this picture I made of my daughter in her bedroom is pretty unusual. I don't photograph my family, but I had been thinking of a way to talk about abortion rights and what happened with the Supreme Court with the Dobbs case. And photographing protests just didn't seem to cut it for me. And one day, my daughter Audrey, who was in high school, she was in the 11th grade at the time, was studying for a Supreme Court class. So I saw her at the dining room table with all her books from the Supreme Court, and I thought, oh, this is perfect. It's this idea of, and she was studying the Dobbs case actually. And I thought it was like the perfect picture to talk about the case and to talk about the future of young women in America. I've spent so much of my life dealing with a rectangle, mostly horizontal, not vertical. How do you fit something? How do you create tension? How do you suggest things that are not in the frame? And then I started thinking about I started wanting more than just the single image, and what happens when what happens when you string a series of pictures together, so that idea of creating a sentence or creating a short essay to say something. And so I think relationships between pictures became important. The space between pictures, you see something and you remember, and then there's a bit of a blank, you jump to the next picture and you have a memory of the previous one. How does it influence your reading of the following picture? And I think the way everything comes together as a sequence was interesting to me, in the way poetics and the rhythms and words and the way they bounce off each other. And so that notion of building up on a sequence of images was interesting, and that culminated in a way with the construction of the cyclorama at MoMA, which are all vertical panels that add up to a unified experience. So the 19th century, it's interesting, of course you work in your medium and you always think, what am I adding to the medium? How am I improving things? How am I changing things? And I'm stuck with this 19th century tool, the View camera, even though it's a modern camera that I have, a modern model that I have. But I think that there's nothing, that it's perfectly okay to use a 19th century tool to explore the world today, because it's about how you use it. It's about the approach, and I think it's completely relevant. Yeah. So, I mean, everyone has their way of using photography, and my way of using photography is to accept the limitations. There's no sound, right? So, I mean, it's crazy that today, when there's so much technology, that people are still paying attention to a still photograph, right? It has almost no information compared to a video on YouTube where there's sound and the images and points of view and this and that, and here you just get one image. But there's something so beautiful about the limitations and working within those limitations, right? And I think that it makes me so humble to work with this medium. And it's the risk of showing a picture that describes things in a particular way, in a specific way, not necessarily the truth, but it's factual, it's evidentiary, and not feel like you need to add a page of text to explain the picture. And I think it's a trust that the medium will suggest something about that moment, that experience, and then trust that the viewer will accumulate that information and process it and experience something that's meaningful to them. I found this pornographic video in the late 90s that involves a young man dressed as Vietnam-era GIs and two Asian women. And it had everything that I was interested in. So the myth of the war in Vietnam, uniforms, landscape, but it was so hard, literally hardcore. I just sort of put it away, and finally I pulled it out and realized that there was probably a good way how to transform them. And so I had stills from the video printed on cotton and embroidered on top. And it's a way to kind of embellish but also obscure certain things, to slow down the way one reads a picture, which is the opposite of what pornography is, which is, this kind of what's the word, when you eat something very quickly. So here you actually have to slow down in order to decipher the picture, and sometimes you don't even see the explicit part. So it was a way to talk about other aspects of the war, the devastation, the vulnerability of women and children, the weaker members of society who are terribly affected by wars and destruction. I'm not certain that visual arts can actually change the world, but maybe we can push things along a little bit, one step at a time. And I think if a picture can make one wonder about certain topics, or enlighten you about something, or give you certain hope that actually things could be different, I think that's a small win. But it's really about bringing attention to human condition, to help us understand the human condition within its complexity, within the darkness, and I think it's about meeting the devil halfway. If you want to talk about the world in its complicated ways, you kind of have to step in and step up halfway and engage with these topics, whether it's going on an aircraft carrier or photographing students, photographing Marines training at war. I think you have to meet the devil halfway.